Good evening and welcome to this edition of Evening Talks. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. Hello. We now take a closer look at a changing dynamic of Russian export structure as Saturday marks the last day of Gazprom's supplies to Austrian OMV, main national gas supplier. So far, Austria was one of the few European countries still dependent on Russian gas, as much as the rest of the continent has reduced imports following the invasion of Ukraine. How important this contract was for the Russian economy, what impact it will have on financing of the costly war. But above all, how come Austria declined to phase out the Russian supplies for so long? Joining me from Prague is Jakub Janda, Director of European Values Center for Security Policy. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Good to have you. So we understand Russia's action to stop the supplies came after OMV said it would stop buying Russian gas to offset 230 million euro arbitration award that it won from the International Chamber of Commerce over a previous cutoff. But to understand the importance of this step taken by Vienna, we need to remember that the Austrian gas imports from Russia dates back to the Cold War. So Austria was one of the first countries to import gas from the Soviet Union at that time in 1968. So what was the philosophy at that time behind such economic openness towards a hostile country from the Western point of view?
Well, Austria has basically been thankful for Russia, or let's say Moscow-led troops of the Soviet Union, for de facto leaving Austria to be formally a neutral state. But Austria, formally speaking, is not a neutral state. It is part of the EU, and it has all these defensive clauses which are at least politically similar to NATO. But I would say it might have made sense during the Cold War, where Austria could have been saying, look, we are not part of this Cold War going between the two powers. But things have changed. For the last 30 plus years, we are or almost 3 decades, we are already in a situation where Austria is part of the Western bloc, where we have Russia openly attacking European countries. So, I would say, in many ways, many people in the Austrian political and business establishment use the neutrality clause as an excuse for getting dirty Russian money into Austria, and at the same time, Austrian state has been serving as the Russian proxy. And I can tell you much more in detail because Czech Republic has been threatened by Russian intelligence operating from the Austrian soil for many, many years, and it is not stopping even now. So things are changing slowly. That's positive and good, but Austria is still, in many ways, in the pocket of Russia.
Very disturbing. Okay, so OMV said today it has sufficient stocks to provide gas to its customers in case of a potential disruption from Gazprom. And said that Austria's storage was more than 90%. So the news is somehow blurring the broader picture, right? So how come Austria declined to phase out the Russian supplies for so long? And what does it tell us about EU strategic independence from Russia's energy sources?
I think the big picture is that Austria and Hungary are both actually serving as basically entry points for Russian interests inside of European Union. Both have different reasons for it and different details, but in a nutshell, the links between the political and financial elites of, in this case, Austria and Russia, are actually very, very deep. And they are not only related to the far right in Austria, which is a completely Russian puppet party, but also to the mainstream parties, the center-right and center-left. And so that's why there is no major surprise, I'm afraid, that after the large-scale Russian invasion to Ukraine 2+ years ago, yes, it's good news that Austria has supported the sanctions, but honestly, if they didn't, I don't know how they could still pretend to be a civilized country. So at least they did support the EU sanctions on Russia. But there are so many things which Austria has not been really doing and has not really been changing, which is honestly amazing because the last 2 years in Europe actually mean that we are preparing for a large European scale war, because that's something what Russia is already waging in Ukraine and could be waging against other European countries. And Austria is still pretending that we are basically just good business partner with Russia, which is honestly amazing and completely absurd.
It's completely absurd. It's difficult to sustain. But it would mean that Austria traditionally is dancing between the West and the East. How sustainable is such a situation and such a policy for a longer run?
I think the current situation indicates and clearly shows that you cannot choose between being a close friend of an ugly and aggressive dictatorship, which is Russia today, and being part of civilized Europe. Because the differences between those two worlds are just so starkly different. So very clearly, I would say, to some extent, geopolitical karma is now hitting Austria, where it is being squeezed, because maybe finally Austria is taking some steps outside of its usual role of a Russian geopolitical puppet in Europe, and Russia doesn't like it for understandable reasons, because that's something of, basically, if you have a slave for such a long time and the slave starts to loosen up at least a bit, if you are the slave owner and dictator, you try to punish it. So that's basically what's happening. And I think it will be very interesting how the Austrian political establishment will react, because it is a significant step in energy dependencies, but still, for example, Vienna is a nest or is a safe haven for Russian intelligence operating mainly against Germany and partly against Czech Republic as well, and partly against Italy. And everybody knows that in Central Europe. And this is not changing. This could have been changed by any Austrian government in the last 5, 10, 15 years, but nobody dared to do any action to even protect its allies, because we are not only neighbors, but within the EU we are allies, even technically speaking. But Austria is a kind of a gap in European security.
Strong words. So you mentioned Hungary and Austria together with Slovakia. These are three countries to getting supplies of Russian gas via a pipeline through Ukraine, despite the fighting there. Ukraine has said it will not extend the transit agreement with Gazprom beyond 2025. So question is, what will happen next year, according to you?
When it comes to energy supplies, I think the big question is actually what happens next year when President Trump will enter office and we could expect some kind of negotiations. I'm really worried, and many people in Central Europe are worried about how these negotiations over any ceasefire in Ukraine will actually look like and what will be the result of it. But if there is any ceasefire, I would expect that there would be major European interest, and countries like Austria and Germany and Hungary and Slovakia would be pushing very hard to make sure that the Russian gas will keep flowing towards them. Because for them, it is economically very good, and they don't really care about such things like Ukrainian sovereignty, for example, or those tens of thousands of people being murdered in Ukraine by Russia. And unfortunately, getting back to dependency on Russian gas, I think honestly will be a strategically stupid decision, but many European countries are really looking forward to go back into it, because commercially or financially speaking, it's easy for them, or easier, despite all these strategic, let's say, impacts, which it will be very, very negative again.
Okay, so we're talking about a strategic but energy comfort, right? If we look at the statistics, prior to the 2022, Russia supplied the EU with 40% of its gas needs. The demand has been satisfied by other supplies since, but the EU still imports more gas from Russia than the US. So is it a question of lack of political will, or is Europe doomed to buy in Russia from other reasons?
It's all about the political and strategic decisions at the end, because governments de facto control what goes on. It is not the private sector. If governments in Europe decide that we will not be getting any gas from Russia, for example, it will happen. Maybe not right away, because it takes time and a lot of money, but it will happen. So it's really about strategic political decisions. And we are in a situation where Russia is not only destroying Ukraine, but also preparing for a global war with Chinese and Iranian and North Korean backing behind Russia as it is preparing. So this is the situation we are in. And if we go back, actually, to keep feeding the Russian war machine with European money through these supplies, we will be feeding basically a beast which is not only now killing Ukrainians, but preparing to start killing other Europeans, like the Baltic nations, for example. But I'm afraid that to some extent, some European countries are willing to go there because commercially and short term, this is something what might look good to them, that it might pay off.
Following your way of thinking, I would like to ask you about Olaf Scholz's conversation with Vladimir Putin. Both spoke on the phone on Friday. It was their first direct exchange in nearly 2 years. So suggestions were that the German Chancellor could have talked about possible gas supplies. What do you think of it?
I don't have direct knowledge over what they discussed, but I mean, again, symbolically, it's pretty bad. We should not have this German chancellor talking to Russian dictator, knowing how Olaf Scholz himself have been a policy failure on Russia, honestly, for most of his career. When he was the finance minister, he was one of the main proponents of Nord Stream 2, Russian elite capture project towards Germany. During his time as the chancellor, his appeasement towards Russia has led to many Ukrainians dying because Russia was not afraid of European reaction. So I'm honestly really hoping that he will lose his elections very soon and we will have a new, much better German chancellor. And I think many people in Ukraine are too.
So Russia was ready to look at energy deals if Berlin was interested. That were the words from the Kremlin that really shed a light on the content of this conversation, does it?
Yes, I can imagine that they discussed that. I don't have direct knowledge of it, but if they did, I would not be surprised. There is a sad Central European joke, which is basically saying, look, Olaf Scholz was always looking forward to start Nord Stream 3. I mean, something like that doesn't exist, but we have seen him, the German Social Democrats, and some other people in German political establishment really hoping to go back to the business as usual with Russia. Despite all the things which happened for the last 3 years, which is the huge casualties in Ukraine, we are closest to World War III thanks to Russian actions and the European appeasement led by Germany over the last decade, let's say, where this government and political parties in German government has led to that. So it would be great to learn from our major mistakes as Europeans. Some Europeans are learning, like Czech Republic finally changed over the last years. For example, we have had very appeasing positions, even on Nord Stream 2, with our previous governments in Prague. But now we have finally a hawkish and very principled governments and president here as well. But some things don't change, and in Germany, many things do not change over appeasing Russia.
Remains to be seen what impact the ending of this contract will have on the financing of the costly war by Russia. Jakub Janda, thank you very much for your insight and for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. And thank you for watching. That's it for this edition of Evening Talk. But please stay with us for more. Coming up next, the situation in Abkhazia.